Winter, 1944. Western Germany. The air is thick with ash from burning towns, smoke rolling low across shattered ground. Gas alarms howl. Masks seal faces. Visibility collapses to a few steps. German commanders expect the advance to stop here. It always had before. But through the haze, American infantry keeps moving, methodical, silent, unstoppable. This was not defiance. It was training overpowering fear. If you want to see how discipline rewrote the battlefield, stay with us. By late 1944, the European battlefield carried a memory older than the war itself. It was the memory of gas. German commanders did not need to imagine what chemical warfare could do to men. They remembered it. Many had worn the same uniforms a generation earlier, choking in the trenches of the First World War as chlorine and phosgene crept along the ground. Those experiences shaped doctrine long after the weapons were shelved. Gas was not simply a weapon, it was a psychological breaker. It froze movement. It shattered coordination. It forced armies to stop, seal themselves, and wait. That belief carried forward into the Second World War. Although large-scale chemical warfare was never unleashed in Europe, the expectation of gas remained embedded in planning. Both sides trained extensively for it. Gas masks were issued, drills repeated, alarms standardized. The assumption was universal: once a gas alert sounded, momentum died. Units slowed to a crawl. Communication fractured. Command timelines collapsed. By 1944, the Western Front provided ideal conditions for that expectation to prove true. The air itself had become hostile. Continuous artillery barrages pulverized forests and towns into fine ash that hung for hours. Strategic bombing turned industrial districts into smoldering fields of debris, filling valleys with smoke thick enough to blot out the sun. Burning fuel dumps, collapsed factories, and shattered rail yards produced choking clouds that stung eyes and lungs even without chemicals present. Visibility was often measured in yards, sometimes less. To German commanders, this environment mirrored the preconditions of chemical warfare. Smoke and ash behaved like gas, low-lying, persistent, disorienting. Gas alarms were triggered constantly, sometimes by real agents in localized incidents, more often by smoke dense enough to convince sentries they were under chemical attack. Either way, the response was the same. Masks went on. Movement slowed. Units became cautious, inward-focused, defensive. And historically, that caution made sense. An infantry unit in gas masks moved slower by default. Breathing was restricted. Peripheral vision narrowed. Speech became muffled. Hand signals replaced shouted orders. Fatigue increased rapidly. In World War I, entire offensives had collapsed under far less. German planning assumed the same would hold true in 1944. Their defensive logic depended on it. If American troops were forced to halt under gas alerts and smoke-heavy conditions, German units could reset lines, reposition reserves, and regain coherence after bombardment. Time, measured in minutes and hours, was everything. Even a brief pause could stabilize a collapsing sector. Ash and smoke were not just environmental obstacles, they were force multipliers. German commanders believed that no army, regardless of numbers or firepower, could maintain coordinated offensive movement while sealed inside masks, advancing blind through burning terrain. History supported that belief. Doctrine reinforced it. Experience validated it. So when U.S. artillery and air power turned sections of Western Europe into blackened, airless landscapes, German expectations hardened into certainty. The advance would slow. Then it would stop. Reports from forward observers initially seemed to confirm this assumption. Gas alarms echoed along defensive lines. Smoke swallowed roads and forests. Visibility vanished. Conditions were textbook. And yet, something unsettling began to surface in German situation reports. American units were not halting for long. Some were not halting at all. Movement continued, not recklessly, not in disorder, but in measured, deliberate steps. Columns emerged from smoke where maps suggested they should have stalled. Timetables slipped, but they did not collapse. Pressure did not ease. At first, German commanders attributed this to confusion in reporting. Then to local anomalies. Then to temporary overextension. But as ash continued to fall and alarms continued to sound, one truth became harder to dismiss. The battlefield conditions that should have paralyzed the attack were no longer doing so, and the reason lay not in the air, but in the men moving through it. By the final months of 1944, Western Europe no longer resembled a landscape meant for movement. It was a place stripped down to fragments, of cities, of forests, of air itself. Entire towns had been reduced to skeletal outlines. Brick dust-coated streets where asphalt had vanished. Roof beams smoldered for days, releasing smoke that settled low and heavy, trapped by winter air. Forests that once offered cover now stood shattered, trees snapped and splintered by months of artillery fire. The ground was uneven, cratered, slick with mud and ash that clung to boots and uniforms alike. Visibility was rarely clear. Smoke drifted unpredictably, pushed by shifting winds, folding back on itself, turning familiar terrain into something unrecognizable. Roads disappeared under debris. Landmarks burned away. Even daylight offered little relief, reduced to a dull gray glow filtered through layers of suspended ash. For soldiers on the ground, orientation became a challenge before combat even began. Maps quickly lost reliability. Compass bearings mattered more than sight. Movement depended on memory, training, and trust in the man ahead. Every step forward risked collision with unseen obstacles, collapsed walls, shell holes filled with water, tangled wire half buried in debris. And above all of it hovered the constant threat of gas. The atmosphere itself carried uncertainty. Smoke from burning fuel and structures was dense enough to trigger gas alarms repeatedly. Sentries reacted to changes in smell or visibility with immediate caution. Once an alarm sounded, procedure took over. Masks were donned without hesitation. Breathing slowed. Peripheral awareness narrowed. In these conditions, even simple actions became complex. A platoon advancing across open ground moved at half speed. Hand signals replaced shouted commands. Orders passed slowly down the line. Any deviation risked separation. Any pause risked losing cohesion entirely. Fatigue set in faster than expected, especially under the added strain of restricted breathing and reduced airflow. German defensive positions were built around this reality. Their observation posts, often set back from the front line, watched through periscopes and narrow firing slits, waiting for the inevitable stall. They expected American units to bunch up, to lose alignment, to hesitate long enough for defensive fire to regain its effect. The battlefield itself was supposed to do half the work. In earlier phases of the war, it usually had. But late 1944 introduced a new layer of complexity, scale. Artillery fire was no longer limited to preparatory barrages. It was continuous, rolling, overlapping. Air strikes did not simply precede ground movement, they reshaped terrain hours and days before infantry arrived. By the time American units advanced, the ground was already transformed into something closer to an industrial wasteland than a traditional battlefield. Ash settled everywhere, inside helmets, along weapon receivers, in the folds of uniforms. It dulled sound and softened edges, absorbing light and distorting distance. Soldiers described the sensation as moving through a living fog, one that shifted without warning. In such an environment, hesitation was dangerous. Stopping too long invited confusion. Units risked losing contact with adjacent elements. Timetables mattered less than momentum. A halted advance could dissolve into isolated groups unable to reorient once the smoke shifted again. German commanders understood this terrain intimately. Many had served on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, or in earlier Western campaigns. They knew what degraded environments did to offensive forces. They trusted the battlefield to impose its own limits. Yet what they observed unsettled that trust. American infantry did not rush through the smoke, but they did not retreat from it either. Columns shortened spacing. Leaders moved closer to their men. Advance rates slowed, but formations held. Even when visibility dropped to a few yards, movement continued along pre-planned routes, measured and deliberate. This was not improvisation. It was execution. The battlefield, as hostile as it was, failed to impose the paralysis German doctrine anticipated. Instead of halting the advance, smoke and ash became conditions to be endured, not barriers to be avoided. And as German observers continued to report American movement emerging from terrain they believed impassable, attention shifted away from the environment itself. The question was no longer what the battlefield was doing to the attackers. It was why the attackers were still moving at all, and what inside their organization allowed them to do so. For the American infantrymen advancing through Western Europe in late 1944, the gas alarm was not a moment of panic. It was a signal to shift posture. Training had made that distinction clear long before men reached the front. Gas warfare, whether real or suspected, was treated not as an extraordinary event, but as a condition of the modern battlefield. From stateside camps to forward training areas in Britain, American soldiers repeated the same drills until they became automatic. Mask on. Seal checked. Weapon adjusted. Move forward. Speed was never the objective. Continuity was. Once the mask was secured, breathing changed. Air came in measured pulls through filters that resisted each inhale. The world narrowed, both visually and audibly. Voices sounded distant, distorted, as if underwater. Peripheral vision collapsed, forcing soldiers to rely on the movement of the man ahead rather than the broader field. But that narrowing was expected. American doctrine did not assume clarity under combat conditions. It assumed confusion. Gas masks were issued with the understanding that they would slow everything, but that slowness could be managed if everyone moved together. Units trained to shorten intervals, to reduce reliance on shouted commands, and to maintain alignment even when visibility dropped to a few feet. Officers and non-commissioned officers were taught to lead from closer positions in such conditions. Distance created risk. Proximity created control. In gas mask movement, leaders positioned themselves where hand signals could still be seen, where physical presence mattered more than voice. This was not bravery. It was procedure. The physical strain was real. Even a fit soldier fatigued quickly under a mask. Moisture collected inside. Lenses fogged despite anti-fog measures. Sweat mixed with ash, stinging eyes and skin. But American training emphasized pacing rather than bursts of speed. Short advances, brief checks, then forward again. Stopping completely was discouraged. A halted unit under gas conditions became vulnerable, not only to enemy fire, but to its own disorientation. Time worked against cohesion. The longer men stood sealed and waiting, the more fatigue and confusion set in. Movement, even slow movement, preserved structure. German commanders expected the opposite reaction. They believed gas conditions would force American units into defensive postures, bunching up as leaders struggled to re-establish control. Instead, what German observers reported was a kind of mechanical persistence. Lines bent but did not break. Advance rates fluctuated, but direction held. This persistence was reinforced by logistics and planning. American units advanced with predetermined routes, phase lines, and fallback reference points. Even when visibility erased visual cues, soldiers moved by count, by compass bearing, by timing rehearsed in advance. If a road disappeared under debris, movement shifted without waiting for new orders. Gas conditions were factored into these plans as delays, not as mission-ending obstacles. There was also an emotional dimension that German doctrine underestimated. American soldiers had been conditioned to treat gas alarms as survivable events. Unlike the trench armies of the First World War, they were not taught to freeze and endure until conditions passed. They were taught to function within them. That distinction mattered. Fear was present, but it was compartmentalized. The act of sealing a mask, checking a buddy, adjusting grip on a rifle, these steps anchored attention on immediate tasks. Routine replaced speculation. In the absence of clear sight and sound, procedure filled the gap. From German observation posts, this behavior was difficult to interpret. What looked like reckless advance was, in reality, disciplined adherence to training. What appeared to be indifference to danger was simply acceptance of conditions already anticipated. As reports filtered back through German command channels, one theme repeated: American units were advancing under gas alarms without the breakdown expected. They were slower, yes. More deliberate, certainly. But they were not stopping. And as this realization spread, German commanders began to understand that the battlefield itself, smoke, ash, and fear, was no longer enough to halt the advance. To stop it, they would need something more than conditions. They would need time. German defensive planning in late 1944 rested on a series of assumptions that had held true for decades. Among the most reliable was the belief that extreme battlefield conditions would impose natural limits on any attacker. Smoke, ash, and the threat of gas were not merely inconveniences, they were forces that shaped behavior. They slowed tempo. They fractured coordination. They bought time. Time was what German commanders needed most. Across the Western Front, German units were stretched thin. Replacements were scarce. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Artillery ammunition was rationed carefully. Defensive success depended on delaying actions, holding just long enough for reserves to shift or for a threatened sector to stabilize. Gas conditions, real or perceived, were supposed to provide that delay. Initial reports from forward observers suggested the familiar pattern. Gas alarms sounded. American units masked up. Movement appeared to slow. German officers noted reduced visibility and assumed the advance would lose momentum, as doctrine predicted. Orders were issued accordingly: hold positions, conserve fire, wait for the enemy to stall. But as hours passed, the expected stall did not materialize. Instead, situation reports began to contain unsettling details. American patrols continued probing through smoke-heavy zones. Infantry formations emerged from areas German maps marked as effectively impassable under current conditions. Timetables slipped, but the direction of movement remained consistent. At first, these reports were treated as anomalies. Commanders attributed them to local overconfidence or reporting errors. Smoke distorted distance. Ash blurred shapes. It was easy to mistake small movements for larger advances. Defensive doctrine allowed for such misreadings, especially under degraded visibility. Yet repetition made denial difficult. Multiple sectors reported similar patterns. Gas alarms did not halt movement. Artillery smoke did not freeze formations. American units advanced more slowly, but they advanced with coherence. Fire coordination followed them forward. Contact with adjacent units was maintained. For German commanders trained to read battlefield behavior, this signaled a deeper problem. Their predictive model, how an enemy should behave under certain conditions, was failing. This failure carried immediate tactical consequences. Defensive fires timed to catch halted units fell on empty ground. Counterattacks launched against expected concentrations encountered dispersed, moving targets instead. Reserves committed too late found Americans already past planned engagement zones. Worse still was the psychological impact. German officers were accustomed to reading the battlefield as a system. Certain inputs produced certain outcomes. When that system stopped responding as expected, confidence eroded. Orders became more cautious. Decision cycles lengthened. Waiting for confirmation replaced initiative. Some commanders began to suspect chemical agents were not actually present, that the gas alarms were false, triggered by smoke and ash alone. But this realization did not restore control. False or not, the conditions were still severe enough that movement should have been degraded. And yet it was not. Reports noted American leaders moving closer to their men, maintaining alignment under conditions that traditionally shattered cohesion. Observers described columns that adjusted spacing instinctively, shrinking or expanding without obvious confusion. What German doctrine interpreted as chaos was, in practice, controlled adaptation. This adaptability forced German commanders into a reactive posture. Instead of shaping the battle through anticipation, they were forced to respond to developments as they unfolded. Defensive plans built around expected pauses unraveled. Lines intended to be temporary became untenable sooner than anticipated. In staff discussions, a troubling conclusion emerged. The Americans were not ignoring gas and smoke. They were operating through them. This distinction mattered. It meant that environmental degradation, once a reliable ally of the defender, no longer guaranteed time. And without time, German defenses lost their most valuable resource. As the realization spread through command channels, one question grew increasingly urgent. If the battlefield itself could no longer stop the advance, then where, exactly, could it be stopped at all? That question would soon be answered, not in theory, but under fire, as momentum carried the Americans into positions German planners had never expected them to reach so quickly. The moment German commanders fully grasped what was happening did not arrive with a single report or a dramatic collapse. It emerged gradually, through a pattern they could no longer explain away. In multiple sectors along the Western Front, American units advanced into areas where doctrine said they should have stalled. These were not breakthroughs marked by sudden speed or overwhelming force. They were advances measured in yards and minutes, carried out under conditions that stripped away visibility, certainty, and comfort. Gas alarms continued to sound. Smoke thickened after artillery concentrations. Ash drifted down like snow, coating helmets and weapons. German defensive positions remained intact, waiting for the pause that never came. Instead, pressure increased. American infantry advanced in short bounds, halting only long enough to re-establish contact and orientation. Fire support followed by schedule rather than sight, lifting and shifting according to pre-arranged timelines. Even when terrain features vanished under debris, movement continued along planned axes. From German observation posts, the effect was disorienting. Defensive fires that should have intersected halted formations instead struck ground already passed. Countermeasures timed for a stalled enemy found no mass targets. The battlefield rhythm German commanders expected, the surge, the pause, the reorganization, was absent. What replaced it was something harder to counter: continuity. As American units pressed forward, German local commanders attempted to impose control through reactive measures. Machine gun nests increased rates of fire, hoping to force a stop. Artillery concentrations were adjusted on the fly, attempting to recreate conditions severe enough to halt movement. But smoke and ash had already reached their practical limit. Additional fire increased destruction, not paralysis. The environment was already hostile. It could not become significantly worse in a way that changed American behavior. The attacking units had adapted to the conditions as they were. This realization marked the turning point. German command timelines collapsed not because of overwhelming losses, but because expected delays never materialized. Reserve movements, already constrained by fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure, could not keep pace with the advancing threat. Units tasked with sealing penetrations arrived too late to be effective. In some sectors, defensive lines dissolved without a formal order to withdraw. Positions intended to hold for hours became untenable within minutes as American infantry emerged from smoke in places not yet covered by fire. German reports from this phase reveal a shift in language. Earlier entries spoke of gas conditions and limited visibility as obstacles to enemy movement. Later reports treated them as constant background factors, no longer decisive, merely present. Attention turned instead to American coordination, to the reliability of their advance even when sensory information was stripped away. The battlefield no longer belonged to those who could see it best. It belonged to those who could function without seeing it at all. For American units, the continued advance under gas alarms reinforced confidence in their own procedures. Training validated itself in real time. Each successful movement reduced hesitation in the next. Momentum built not from speed, but from consistency. For German commanders, the effect was corrosive. The realization that environmental conditions could no longer be counted on forced a reassessment under fire. Decisions had to be made faster, with less certainty, against an enemy that no longer behaved predictably. Defensive doctrine lagged behind reality. The turning point, then, was not a single engagement. It was the moment German commanders understood that the tools they relied on to slow the enemy, terrain, smoke, fear, had lost their power. The advance would not stop simply because conditions were unbearable. It would stop only when physically blocked. By the time that conclusion took hold, American infantry was already moving beyond positions German planners believed they had hours, sometimes days, to defend. The smoke still hung in the air. The ash still fell. But the momentum had shifted, and it was moving in only one direction. When the smoke began to thin and the gas alarms finally fell silent, the shape of the battlefield had already changed. Not dramatically, not with a sudden collapse of front lines, but with a steady displacement that was impossible to reverse. Ground that German planners believed could be held through delay was no longer in their control. The immediate aftermath was measured in repositioning rather than retreat. German units pulled back from exposed positions, seeking terrain where observation and fire could be re-established. These movements were orderly on paper, but uneven in execution. Roads choked with debris slowed withdrawal. Fuel shortages limited the ability to redeploy heavy weapons. Communications lagged behind events. American units, by contrast, consolidated forward positions with methodical precision. Clearing teams moved through newly taken ground, securing intersections, marking routes, and establishing reference points for follow-on forces. The same discipline that sustained movement under gas conditions now stabilized the advance. What mattered most was not the distance gained, but the time lost. German defensive plans depended on predictable pauses, intervals during which lines could be reorganized and pressure absorbed. Those pauses never fully occurred. The continuous nature of the American advance compressed decision cycles and magnified every delay in German response. This had psychological consequences as significant as the tactical ones. German commanders reported a growing sense of uncertainty. Environmental conditions that once offered reassurance now provided no reliable advantage. Smoke and ash still degraded visibility, but they no longer implied safety or respite. Every obscured approach had to be treated as a potential avenue of advance. Defensive caution increased, but caution carried its own costs. Units hesitated to commit reserves without clearer information. Fire discipline tightened to conserve ammunition, reducing immediate stopping power. The balance between restraint and decisiveness shifted unfavorably. American confidence, meanwhile, grew quietly. The experience of advancing under conditions expected to halt them reinforced trust in training and procedure. Units that had moved through gas alarms without breakdown carried that lesson forward. Subsequent operations treated degraded visibility as a known quantity rather than an exceptional hazard. This shift affected planning at higher levels. American commanders incorporated the demonstrated ability to operate under extreme conditions into their operational timelines. Smoke and ash were no longer assumed to impose fixed delays. Schedules became more aggressive, not because troops were expected to move faster, but because they were expected to keep moving. German intelligence assessments began to reflect this change, albeit belatedly. Reports acknowledged that environmental degradation alone could not be relied upon to slow American operations. Defensive calculations adjusted, but the strategic situation left little room for new solutions. Losses during this phase were uneven. German units suffered primarily from displacement and erosion rather than catastrophic defeat. Positions abandoned under pressure were often reoccupied briefly elsewhere, only to be lost again as momentum carried forward. The cumulative effect was exhaustion, material, logistical, and psychological. American casualties remained present and real, but the advance did not fragment. Cohesion held. That cohesion, more than any single engagement outcome, defined the aftermath. The broader consequence extended beyond the immediate sector. The realization that American forces could sustain offensive momentum under conditions previously considered prohibitive altered expectations along the Western Front. Defensive depth mattered less when attackers did not require ideal conditions to advance. Time, already scarce, became the decisive currency. By the end of the period, German commanders no longer framed their situation around stopping the advance under adverse conditions. They framed it around delaying the inevitable. And as positions continued to shift and lines continued to bend, the meaning of what had occurred began to crystallize, not as a single tactical failure, but as a demonstration of how modern warfare had changed. That realization would linger long after the ash settled, shaping how the campaign was understood, and setting the stage for a final reckoning beyond the battlefield itself. In the final winter months of the war in Western Europe, the battlefield offered no clarity, only smoke, ash, and uncertainty. Towns burned without shape. Forests stood shattered and silent. The air itself became something to endure rather than breathe. For German commanders, these conditions had once represented control. They were the natural limits of human movement, the point at which fear and fatigue imposed order on chaos. History had taught them that armies could be slowed without being destroyed, simply by forcing them to wait inside unbearable conditions. What unfolded in late 1944 challenged that lesson. American troops did not overcome gas and ash through exceptional courage or reckless speed. They did so through preparation that assumed the worst long before it arrived. Training replaced improvisation. Procedure replaced panic. Movement continued not because the battlefield was manageable, but because it had already been anticipated. This shift mattered far beyond any single advance. It revealed a form of warfare in which environment alone could no longer dictate outcomes. Smoke and darkness still killed. Gas alarms still induced fear. But they no longer guaranteed paralysis. The side that could function when senses failed gained an advantage that could not be easily countered. For the German defense, this realization came too late. Plans built around delay unraveled when delay could not be enforced. The battlefield ceased to offer predictable pauses. Every moment of hesitation became a liability rather than a safeguard. For the American soldier, the experience reinforced a quieter truth. Modern combat did not reward those who waited for ideal conditions. It rewarded those who accepted disorder as permanent and moved within it. By the time the ash settled, the ground taken was less important than the lesson learned. War had changed. It was no longer enough to make the battlefield unbearable. An army prepared to operate inside that discomfort could continue forward, even when vision failed and the air turned hostile. And in the gray, choking landscapes of Western Europe, that understanding carried American infantry through smoke and ash, not because the conditions allowed it, but because nothing in their training had taught them to stop when they arrived.